Welcome to an introduction to iteration planning. In this video, we'll talk about the benefits and characteristics of this agile planning activity. Iteration planning is held at the beginning of each iteration. So before we start any iteration, we want to have a planning meeting so that we can discuss what things to include in the iteration and what things not to include. Iteration planning helps decentralize control by having the whole team get involved in the planning process versus one person, such as, for example, the project manager. Iteration planning improves decision-making since it provides transparency into what things the team is considering when deciding whether or not to assign certain user stories to a sprint. Iteration planning is also a mechanism to help us ensure that plans evolve as a project progresses. So as we progress through the project, our iterations may reflect different changes that we may have in prioritization or requirements or an understanding of complexity as we progress along the project. By doing iteration planning, we also help maximize the value of a project as we're looking into how can we deliver the maximum business value in each iteration. In iteration planning, we're also identifying the specific goals of that iteration or the theme of that iteration. It's important that the iteration length has three different main characteristics. First, we want the length to maintain a sense of urgency, so we want it short enough to help keep teams motivated and to also simplify planning, understanding, and control. When iterations are too long, it starts to become complicated again to understand how to plan and break things down into tasks. Shorter iteration lengths or appropriate iteration lengths also help us to estimate velocity by understanding how much work did we get in a similar iteration length in a previous iteration. Iteration length also increases learning and efficiency when they're an appropriate size because they allow frequent evaluation and they support rapid adaptation. So when we have an appropriately small and short iteration length, we're able to adapt quickly after we've completed the iteration by looking into things that we've learned along the way. Some of the factors you might want to consider when choosing an iteration length for your team are how prepared and how much review has the team done on the user stories. Do we understand them well enough to be able to go for 2, 3, 4 weeks, or do we need a shorter iteration length? We also want to consider the time to deliver value. If we're in a hurry to show some value or some wins to our stakeholders, we might want to stick with a shorter iteration. Another consideration is time for testing. Do we have enough time to start testing things in our iteration? And release date. What is our release date and how do we break up our iterations into short enough iterations that we have enough that we can get stuff done before the release? And then lastly, what's the level of uncertainty? When we have greater uncertainty, our iteration length needs to be shorter so that we can learn more, decrease risk, and improve and iterate along the way. The iteration planning meeting is the meeting where we actually do the iteration planning, and this meeting should not last longer than 2 hours for each week of iteration. Obviously, it can last shorter. However, we like to time box it at 2 hours so we're sure that we don't go over that time. The objective of the iteration planning meeting is that the team will be asking questions of the product owner to gain clarity and to better be able to break their stories into tasks. In this meeting also, the team determines whether the initial estimates that they gave in the release planning meeting need to be adjusted. As we mentioned also, the team breaks stories into tasks in the iteration planning meeting, and they reach a consensus on the amount of user stories or the amount of work to get done. In the iteration planning meeting, we want all the key project team members to participate, including the product owner, who will provide clarity and answer questions, the project manager, who will be thinking about the different considerations about the iteration planning meeting, asking the right questions, ensuring the right communication is happening. In a Scrum setting, this would also be the Scrum Master, and the development team.